Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer over at War on the Rocks, and what follows is Aaron O'Connell moderating a discussion with Jim Goldgeier, Deborah Pearlstein, Jeremi Suri, and Sheena Greitens about the classification process, how it can get better, and why that matters for U.S. democracy.
I'm Aaron O'Connell. I'm the Director of Research here at the Clements Center for National Security and an Associate Professor in the History Department. Our first panel is entitled Scholars and Documents, A Complicated Relationship. And here's how we'll proceed. I'll introduce our panelists. They'll then give about 5 minutes of opening remarks on the role of declassification in scholarship. And then I'll give them a few questions. And then we'll open it up to the audience so that everybody can participate and ask questions. Before I read the introduction, I just thought a thing that would be interesting to weigh on. We are a combination of political scientists and historians up here. For the historians in the room, I know we have quite a number. Maybe just put into your head, what moments in history have been radically reinterpreted when a document was declassified? When new information came to light? Can you think of any? I have 3 or 4 in my mind, but it's a great little test to understand the importance of declassification in scholarship when you can actually think of how history was changed when the secrets became public. But that'll be later. Let's first begin with introductions and our opening remarks. Our first speaker will be Dr. James Goldgeier. He's a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and a professor of international relations at the School of International Service at American University, where he also served as dean from 2011 to 2017. He's a senior advisor to the Bridging the Gap initiative, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Raymond Frankel Foundation, and he serves as the co-editor of the Oxford University Press Bridging the Gap book series. In addition to authoring or co-authoring 4 books, he is co-editor with Joshua Shifrinson of Evaluating NATO Enlargement, From Cold War Victory to the Russian-Ukraine War, to be published by Palgrave Macmillan later this spring. Jim, the floor is yours for opening remarks.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks. Oh, it's always such a thrill to be at UT Austin and at the invitation of the Clements Center. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I wanted to, follow up, as Aaron said, talking about the importance of declassification for scholarship. And I would argue also for current policy discussions. And I would just give a shout out to Professor Inboden's book, The Peacemaker, on Ronald Reagan. Truly remarkable accomplishment, the book, and how important the insights are of Reagan's role and especially the relationship, his efforts on diplomacy with the Soviet Union, which I've been going back through as I think about how we may relate to Russia in the current context. But so I do want to say a few words about the U.S.-NATO-Russia relationship at this moment in time and how important declassification has been, because there's a narrative out there, it's especially promulgated by President Putin, that the U.S. sought and still seeks to keep Russia down. Well, the U.S. has certainly sought to prevent Russia from taking territory that doesn't belong to it. But I think the historical record is pretty clear that in the post-Cold War period, the United States really did a lot to try to reach out to Russia and assist Russia in its post-communist transition and bring Russia closer to the West. And there's certainly a lot of debate, and should be a lot of debate, about what happened and why, but we can't really have that debate properly without an understanding of the historical record. Back in 2018, I was Googling, I don't even remember what I was Googling for, but I was Googling something, and up popped the Clinton Presidential Library site. And I realized that the library had declassified the Clinton-Yeltsin record, about 56, I think, phone calls, memorandum of conversation from their telephone conversations, and another 18 in-person meetings that they had had. And they had declassified the records of those meetings. I learned later in response to requests from the National Security Archives, Svetlana Savranskaya, and historian Mary Sorati. And what was really, first of all, what was truly amazing about this, hundreds of pages of documents, there was one sentence redacted. which is pretty unusual, and I think is a demonstration of how most of the things that get redacted don't need to be redacted. And in fact, there were things in there when I was reading, I was like, I can't believe that wasn't redacted. But then I realized, it didn't really, it didn't really need to be. And I was pleased then to be able to write up a piece on the documents for the Texas National Security Review. I'm trying to give as many plugs as possible here to this
You're
place.
doing well, Jim.
Yeah, I'm working it.
Welcome back here anytime.
Yeah, thanks. So I had earlier written a book with Mike McFall on U.S.-Russia relations in the aftermath of the Cold War. We covered the period from about 1991 to 2002. And so I knew a lot about the relationship based on interviews, but reading the documents gave me a greater appreciation for three key issues. One was just how important it was for Yeltsin to be treated as an equal. And I would argue that this has been an enormous motivation for the Soviet Union and then Russia since the Khrushchev period. There was a brief window in the 1970s when, the two countries, the US and the USSR, were seen as equal superpowers. But certainly, this has not been the case since the late 1980s. Clinton went out of his way over and over again to try to say to Yeltsin, I'm treating you as an equal. I'm treating, he really, and he did certain things. He would remind Yeltsin, we changed the G7 to a G8, things like that. But it required sort of constant reassurance. And I would argue this has been a big issue. For example, President Obama's comment that Russia is just a regional power. Those kinds of things definitely grate on the Russian leadership. Reading the record also clarified for me in a way that I hadn't really thought as much about prior to reading the record, just how much they accomplished in their first term, how much less they accomplished in their second terms, and how much of what they accomplished was really about resolving legacy issues from the Soviet period, as opposed to charting new cooperation going forward. Things like the disposition of strategic nuclear weapons. Soviet Union broke apart. There were 4 countries with strategic nuclear warheads on their territory: Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia. And the United States and Russia worked together so that only Russia would come out of that as a nuclear power. Certainly a bit of a controversy today, for sure. Making sure the Red Army troops were removed from the Baltics, those kind of post-Soviet legacy issues. But for things going forward, really not as much in terms of lasting cooperation. Which brings me to NATO enlargement, hugely debated topic. That's why we have an edited volume. Josh Schifrinson and I have very different views on NATO enlargement, have this volume coming out this spring. In my view, the United States rightly pursued this policy, and Josh isn't here to argue the opposite. And Clinton worked hard to keep this issue from harming the relationship. Russia did join the Partnership for Peace. It joined the implementation force in Bosnia after the Dayton Accords were signed, and Russia signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act. What you see from the documents is just how much Yeltsin obviously made his displeasure known about NATO enlargement. But the conversation wasn't nearly as dramatic as the conversation over the Kosovo War, where Yeltsin was really furious about the NATO-led war against Serbia. And I think, what I've come to appreciate since reading those and then thinking more about it is that what people miss when they complain about how much damage NATO enlargement did to the U.S.-Russia relationship is that the first 2 rounds, the 10 countries coming in, occurred in the shadow of much bigger concerns to the Russian government. The first 3 members, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, came in March of '99 as NATO was launching this war. The war against Kosovo was a much bigger deal for the Russians. And the second round, the so-called Big Bang, including the Baltic countries in 2004, was occurring during the color revolutions. Those color revolutions were a much bigger deal to Putin than NATO enlargement was, because he saw it as a direct threat to his own rule. These are live issues. They've had a big impact on how people view the war. They've had a big impact on Putin's propaganda efforts and whether they're successful or not. And understanding the historical context, which is assisted by our access to understanding the historical record, is thus key to our historical understanding and our scholarship, but it feeds into current policy discussions in important ways. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, our second speaker today is Sheena Greitens. She's an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT, where she directs UT's Asia Policy Program, a joint initiative of the Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. She is also a Jean Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at AEI and an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Greitens' research focuses on American national security, East Asia, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy. Her first book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, good title, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, came out from Cambridge in 2016 and received multiple academic awards. She's got two other book manuscripts in progress, one from on authoritarianism and diaspora politics in North Korea, and the other on internal security and Chinese grand strategy. Sheena, you've got 5 minutes.
Terrific.
Explain the world.
I will say this is the first time I think I've been named as part of Murderer's Row, so I'm not sure how to process that. I'm going to have to think about that later. Second, one caveat, I am the representative political scientist on this panel, which means that largely that I practice history without a license. So take those, filter my comments today accordingly. Okay, all right. I thought you were more of a historian, Jim. So, a lot of the conversation today will talk mostly about the utility of declassification for understanding American democracy and American foreign policy itself. And I will second the remarks of the panelists and the welcoming remarks so far in saying that I do believe that declassification of records is essential for understanding the workings of American democracy and of our own foreign policy. But what I wanted to focus on today, since I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about that, is also the contribution that American declassification can make to the history of other parts of the world and really to a shared global history. And I saw that really firsthand in the book that you very kindly mentioned, which is a book about Cold War history in Taiwan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And so I spent a lot of time at the National Archives and a couple of different presidential libraries looking at the Cold War domestic politics of those three countries, but the records were uneven. Those countries were not democracies, and the declassification and records retention policies in, for example, the Philippines are still very much being debated. There are documents that remain with the armed forces of the Philippines that have not yet been transferred to any archive or library for processing, and even though they've formally been sort of turned over legally, there is no physical custody transfer, and so those records remain inaccessible to the public for scholarship. And so in the absence of some of those records, and it's also been clear that at least some of the records have been destroyed just by the climate and where they were stored, and maybe for other reasons as well over the course of decades. And so what that means is that some of the best insights we have not only on the U.S. alliance with each of those countries, but actually reporting on domestic developments and the political history of those countries comes from the conversations and the observations of American diplomats and American personnel who were on the ground in those countries and talking with counterparts and with members of society about those developments. And so, for example, I read really extensively through the conversations that the United States had with Chiang Kai-shek and other members of the ROC government in the late 1940s after Chiang Kai-shek and a small group of his supporters had moved to the island of Taiwan. And the United States really had very difficult conversations with him in this period about the need to get not only sort of foreign policy and what we would consider his relationship with the United States reoriented, but also really the need to much better manage the governance of Taiwan itself as the last remaining sort of territory that the KMT controlled. And that had massive effects on how Chiang Kai-shek subsequently governed Taiwan. And the book looks really at some of the effects of that shift in policy that Chiang and the KMT pursued over the course of the 1950s. So the reason that I use that example and that I stress that, I could go through similar examples from South Korea and from the Philippines as well over the course of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s until those countries became democracies. But just to emphasize that the United States, because it has now for so many decades had a truly global reach and impact on the world, not only has insights in declassified materials that are important for understanding our role in the world, but that are also just important in understanding developments across many regions of the world and the way that those developments interact with each other to form and constitute a global history. And I think it's really important to just understand that there's that there are both of those dimensions, and that declassification contributes to both of those things. It is fundamentally a question and a responsibility for us as American citizens and American scholars and policymakers, but there is also a contribution that we are choosing to make toward the understanding that people can have literally around the world of their own history, and of the history of the relationships between countries and actors in a global environment. The only thing I wanted to add briefly, if I have a minute to do so, is to put one small asterisk that also emerged very clearly from the historical work that I did, and to say that there's a narrow scope condition where I would continue to exert a lot of caution on the declassification process. And I mention this because in some ways I think setting those narrow scope conditions actually helps us be more permissive about declassification in other cases. And that is that in a lot of the cables I read, there were foreign sources named over and over again who were providing important information and insights to the United States and therefore to this historical record. And in non-democracies, the stakes of sharing or passing on that information can be very high, often deadly. And so I think about today how we manage a declassification process, and I know this is essential and fundamental, and Director Haynes talked about this last night, but how we, implement that process of transparency and that principle of transparency in a way that respects the safety and, frankly, the principled courage of the people who are sometimes sharing that information. Again, I identify that as a narrow scope condition because I think it makes it easier then to talk about the importance of declassifying things more broadly and of then creating that shared global history that I think the United States can offer both to ourselves and to the rest of the world.
Finally, our third speaker is Dr. Jeremi Suri. He is the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership and Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and Professor of History in the College of Liberal Arts and in the LBJ School. He is the author and editor of 11 books on contemporary politics and foreign policy, so many that they don't fit on one page. Most recently, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Earlier ones in sort of a rude 2 to 3 year chunks that make all other scholars feel a little bit concerned. He's published The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building from the Founders to Obama, Henry Kissinger in the American Century, and the list goes on. Jeremi, you've got 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Mark Lawrence, and others for organizing this event. It's really a pleasure to be here. A great job last night, Adam, by the way. Really wonderful way to start us out. So, as Aaron said, I'm a historian, and the first thing any historian has to say, particularly a diplomatic historian, is that the work we do wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the declassification of documents, right? This is the lifeblood of what we do, and the work that the Foreign Relations Series and the State Department Office does is so crucial. But I don't think of documents in the way I used to, and I don't think of declassification in the way I used to. As a grad student, we were always, trying to find that smoking gun document that would allow us to show that all the people who had written books on the subject were wrong. And such a document doesn't exist in most cases. There are some rare cases. Aaron will have a few. The reason declassification matters is because we want to be able to read a large stream of documents. We want to understand the broader climate of thinking. We want to understand the broader relationships as they develop. So releasing one document here and one document there, as many societies do, and as sometimes we do around certain issues, doesn't help as much as having that larger stream of documents. And I think that's really what we care about. I think there are 3 ways we can think about this, 3 reasons why more full declassification, more of a culture of declassification will be crucially important for us. First, it's the only way we can understand why decision makers do what they do. They always tell us why they think they're doing what they do, but that's not always why they do what they do. It's not conspiratorial, right? We're driven by many motivations. The mystery of history is what is it in a particular set of circumstances that drives us to think a certain way. And when we have a larger stream of documents, a larger archive of documents with more perspectives, we're able to reconstruct the thinking of decision makers. There's no other way to do that. That's what's so hard for us in the policy space, to reconstruct the thinking of Vladimir Putin. But at the very least, we need to be able to reconstruct the thinking of our own policymakers. And it's only through the fuller declassification that we can do that. It's very hard when you only have a small collection of documents or a collection of documents around a particular set of issues. What a larger stream of documents give us is they give us a sense of how ideas have developed and been put into practice. And so I think a great example of this, we're in the LBJ Presidential Library, our knowledge, our understanding of Lyndon Johnson's complex motivations as a Southern Democrat, but yet an advocate of civil rights, as a Cold Warrior, but yet someone who had his doubts about Vietnam from the start, as someone who was a confident political actor, but also living in the shadow of the Kennedy family. All of these complex issues that so many in this room have written about, these issues you can only really understand when you have a fuller sense of the documentation around decision making. And so that's one of the main reasons why we need a fuller documentary record, and we're nowhere near where we should be, in fact, if we want to reconstruct these issues. There's a second reason, which is that when we're trying to understand a foreign society that we've had long-term relations with, often the best source we have are our own sources. So if you want to understand the development of Iranian policy in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, you're not going to be able to go to the Iranian archive, everyone realizes. It's actually our record, our long, deep, extensive record of relations with Iran that is actually one of the best global sources for understanding Iranian policy. And so a fuller declassification, particularly of high-level and often sensitive interactions between our society and another society, is absolutely crucial if we're ultimately going to be able to understand how that society's thinking about the world has evolved. And I would say this, and Sheena might correct me, but I think so much of what we understand about Chinese foreign policy, so much of what we understand about the ways in which China has developed as a society, as an entity, actually comes from our reading of American documents, American interactions with Chinese interlocutors of one size or one kind or another. Now, this is not an argument for only relying on American documents, but it is an argument for the ultimate value, the global value that actually American documents provide in understanding the larger policy space that we operate in. And then the third point, right, we have the importance of the documents to understanding the development of our policy. We have the importance of the documents to understanding the development of other societies' policies. The third point I'd make that I think is often forgotten in these discussions is that declassification is crucial, not simply for holding particular leaders accountable, but for informing the American public about how our policy is made. And counteracting, I think, a tendency that has long existed, a tendency that goes back to the 19th century, which is to weaponize secrecy at home as well as abroad. And I'm going to cross into political territory here. I think there's been too much of that in the last few years. The use of selective release of documentation, selective leaking of information through Congress, through elsewhere, through the White House at times, the selective leaking of information, which is not a new story, but a story that has been done quite frequently or followed quite frequently in a way to try to distort current debates, to distort the way we understand how one actor or another actor has interacted with a foreign entity of one kind or another. Full declassification provides our press and our citizen body with a way to actually make fairer judgments, and it disempowers those who would try to use selective secrecy to actively distort the political environment. And I think it's the paradox of our moment that we have so much information, but so much selective use of secret information. And the best way I know of to counteract that would be to create more of a culture of openness and make it harder for individual actors, even empowered actors, to weaponize the materials that they have. I want to close on these 3 points about the breadth of documentation, getting beyond individual documents, having a broader stream of documents for understanding American thinking, foreign thinking, and our democracy. To just bring up a final point on this, and it's something that I'm saying in part because Adam is here from the historian's office, but it's really important. The Foreign Relations Series of the United States, which is a really monumental collection of documents published by our government on American foreign policy, I am always struck by how often it is used by scholars, citizens, journalists all over the world. And to think about the value that provides, not just in terms of historical information, but American public diplomacy and America's image. And to think about how we could use that as more of a model for the way we think about documentation in other agencies and other parts of our government. I often ask myself, why don't we have a foreign relations series for the intelligence agencies? I kind of know the answer, but why don't we have a foreign relations series for the Defense Department, for so many other parts of our government? I do think that the openness of information is generally to our credit as a society, and the closure of information is often, even though we do have to, as you said, Sheena, we have to protect certain sources. The historian in me says the closure of information usually benefits our enemies more than it benefits ourselves. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suri. Okay, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask 2 questions, and then we'll open up to the audience for everyone to discuss. And I'll just ask the panelists, and feel free to weigh in on either of the 2 at any time. So the first is basically the job of scholars is to make relevant distinctions. So let's see if we can make some relevant distinctions about this crucial issue of documents, scholarship, and the need for secrecy. So do you have a personal scorecard? How do you think we are doing managing the needs for state secrets in certain cases with the need for openness in civil society? Dr. Greitens gave us a nice early scope condition. Let's not reveal the names of overseas spies. That's a pretty good one. Are there others you might think, like, this obviously should not, even if it would be good for the public to learn about, this obviously has to be protected? So that's the first question. Personal scorecard on the balance, these 2 important imperatives. And the second is just to return to my first one, any smoking guns? Do any scholars up here or in the audience know of a moment where a document declassified changed in interpretation, caused whole books to be obsolete because the new information really definitively settled some kind of historical or policy issue? So take either one you like. If it's okay, can I go down the line? Jim, do you want to start? Or?
Well, sure. Happy to start. On the first one, we heard last night from Director Haynes. She says there's way too much overclassification, and that's harming. It's harming democracy because it's important for citizens to be able to know what's going on and to be able to hold their government accountable. So, I was really pleased to hear that, and also pleased to hear her call for more resources for declassification, which is critical to actually getting things declassified that may be overclassified in the first instance. It's interesting. I mentioned that when I went through the Clinton Presidential Library documents, there were moments when I was really surprised that there were things that hadn't been redacted. So I'll give you one example, and then why, then when I thought about it, I thought, this didn't need to be redacted. So one of the big issues between Clinton and Yeltsin was the issue of Russian support for the Iran nuclear reactor at Bushehr, and in general, what Russian firms were doing to support Iran in the nuclear space that might then create a problem for support for an Iranian nuclear weapons program. And one of the features of these presidential documents, by the way, that's really important is that because you see the conversations unfold over time, it's just how important it was for each leader to make asks of the other, for the other to respond, and then in follow-up meetings for each to say, remember I said I would do this and I did that, and as a way of building trust. And one of the things that Clinton was pushing was for Yeltsin to rein in what was going on, the transfers from Russia to Iran. And so Clinton raised it at one of these meetings, and Yeltsin said, you've raised this before. I've done something about this. This isn't happening. And Clinton said, well, in fact, we have evidence that there are Russian firms continuing to support Iran in ways that you might not be aware of, and I'm going to hand you this piece of paper that will explain our understanding of this, that information that might be helpful to you. And I was like, especially because it was about a nuclear program. I was like, gosh, I'm really surprised to see this. But of course, it was about a nuclear program, but the conversation did not reveal sources and methods, right? There was nothing about the conversation that revealed anything that couldn't be shared. It was interesting that the United States felt it needed to help Yeltsin understand what was going on, whether he was, willfully not understanding it or whether he really didn't have the capacity to know what certain parts of, the Russian government in conjunction with other Russian entities might be doing. We don't know. But I think that's the... I think that sort of gets to this, right? It's about sources and methods. It's about, helping, providing information that would enable people to, build nuclear weapons more easily, those kinds of things. You expect those things to remain out of the public view. But other things should, we should be able to discuss them and to understand them. And I think in that case, it gave us a greater understanding of both the challenges on the Russian side, the way in which the United States was pursuing something that was important to it, and providing information to the Russian government. I mean, you could argue. That exchange is embarrassing to Yeltsin, but there's no reason why we shouldn't know about it.
Great, thank you, Dr. Greitens.
Yeah, let me take your second question first. And I can think of at least 3 instances from the field that I'm working on right now, which is Chinese history and politics, where access to information that was previously concealed has really changed our understanding of political developments inside China and China's relationships with the outside world. The first is The Great Leap Forward, and there's a great book called Tombstone that I would commend to anybody who's interested in the tragedy that is the Great Leap Forward, that was done by a Chinese scholar whose father died in the famine, in the Great Leap Forward. And he spent a lot of his career going around to different provincial and local archives and piecing together accounts of the impact of the famine, and tells a much more complete and really compelling story about the costs of that policy and about decision-making at various levels of the Chinese political system. And without his work, which was courageous and for which he's paid a political price, he writes that the book is a tombstone to his father, to all those who died, and potentially to himself, or for himself. It hasn't gone that far yet, but it's pretty clear that this was a risky and a costly decision for him to publish this book. It's only been published in Hong Kong and then in English language editions. But I think we have a very different understanding and much more complete understanding of that tragedy as a result of the work that he's done. The second is Tiananmen in 1989, where the opening of archives, the Chinese archives are still by and large, pretty restricted. That's become even more so over the course of the past decade. And in fact, the only time I have ever been interviewed by the Chinese security services or the government about what exactly I was doing in a particular place at a particular time was asking to read copies of the local paper at a municipal archive in northern China. So archival research is often difficult, has become more difficult over the course of the past decade, as the party has really tried to sort of exert ownership over a particular narrative of party history. So we've been forced to rely on, for example, mirror documentation from other communist states whose archives have now been opened, and understand their conversations with Chinese leaders and Chinese diplomats. And again, I think that's changed our understanding of how much global politics drove China's response to events in Tiananmen, not just sort of domestic concern about either elite or popular protest. And then the third one is the Sino-Soviet split, where I think the United States had a very different understanding and really kind of missed the fundamental and complete rupture that occurred around 1960, at least for a couple of years. And had that information been more available earlier, it might have actually changed American foreign policy during that period of the Cold War in ways that are complex and very hard to predict. But we simply can't rerun the tapes of history and find out. But those are 3 events that I can think of that our understanding has really shifted as the result of this sort of accumulation of good historical work. In terms of how how we're doing, I think there's a lot of work to do. I do think that it's important to acknowledge that email has made this problem sort of exponentially more challenging. And I know we have a panel talking about technology coming up later this morning. But I will say, just to give you one small example of what this looks like, we are a public university. And I received a Freedom of Information Act equivalent request for all of the emails that I had sent at one point since a certain period while I was at UT, sent or received. I actually had no idea how many that was, but I had to go do a count because we had to estimate how long it would take someone to go through and review all of these for student privacy and other reasons. And it turned out it was about 7,000 emails in a 15-month period. And I'm not a particularly high-volume emailer. I do anything I can to avoid spending time on email. So if you think about that in much larger government bureaucracies with much more important issues in terms of the sensitivity of sources or the topics being covered, and you think about someone who's worked in government for a decade and just one person, what going through their records looks like, I think you begin to get a sense of the scope and just the difficulty of separating the kind of the wheat from the chaff and the things that need to be reviewed closely and the things that are like, can you meet at 2:00 today? Which should be pro forma, but we don't have as good a way to go through those kinds of records so I want to acknowledge both just the challenge that the intelligence community is grappling with, especially in the sort of post-email era, but also as a result of that, I think it's very clear that we are not keeping up. And there are things that are well past the 30-year declassification timeline that is sort of a hypothetical benchmark for when we should be able to review things that clearly are not accessible and that would shed light on policy. One of the things I learned from looking at the record of Chinese history that I think is important for policy to pick up on Jim's point a moment ago is that it gives you a certain humility about decision making. And that's not to let policymakers off the hook, right? It's why we need to see what they are seeing. But it also sometimes wow, what we saw from the outside really wasn't quite right on this particular closed society. And I think that's an important lesson for policy as we think about how to grapple with the uncertainty of some of the challenges that we deal with. But just as an overall scorecard, no, we're not where we need to be. We need to push more toward the transparency and declassification side. Absolutely. I think that's very clear as a sort of bottom line verdict.
Something below a gentleman's C on the report card.
Ooh. I was trying not to quantify it.
Fair enough. Dr. Suri.
So when I think of smoking guns, there are the cases, Aaron and I were talking about this before, the Venona documents, which of course did change the way we see Alger Hiss, or the way some people see figures like Alger Hiss and others. But really when I think about smoking guns, I think about a range of documents and a range of material that when looked at closely has fundamentally changed the conventional wisdom. So I'll give two examples of many. The book I just finished on the legacies of the Civil War, I spent a lot of time on Ulysses Grant. His papers are all published. They've been published, I think it's 73 volumes of his letters. But what you realize, and it's not unique to me, but what a group of historians the last 4 or 5 years have realized, reading those letters closely in light of the world we're in, is that the image almost everyone has in this room of Grant from high school history is entirely wrong. That he wasn't a drunk. He wasn't someone who in the White House was dominated by corruption, but actually cared very deeply about civil rights. It still doesn't change his failures as a president, but it changes the ways you think about the presidency, the modern presidency evolving, because here you have a president who wants to do the right things. I think it's pretty clear he does. He spent hours every day reading letters written by Southerners, Southern Republicans and Southern freedmen and women, describing the horrors of their condition, describing the racism in the South, and how little power he had within his own party to act upon that. It actually makes you appreciate someone like Lyndon Johnson in a different kind of way when you see how difficult these issues are. That is not the way the story was told based on the non-private documentation. So that's one example of how reading documents fundamentally change the way we see a historical figure, and we see something like the presidency, an office like the presidency in our own time. I'll give it a contrary example. When I was writing my book on Henry Kissinger, Kissinger himself and most scholars of Kissinger, whether they liked him or didn't like him, the argument was that American foreign policy for Nixon and Kissinger was driven by their own ideas of foreign policy and the international system that they were in, and that domestic politics didn't matter. And if you have Henry Kissinger in any setting, even at 99, he'll make sure to tell you that in the first few minutes. And most people believe that, right? He's the grand realist. You get into the documents and you immediately realize that's actually not true. That the volume of discussion of domestic politics is extraordinary. Just one example. During the 73 war, during the Yom Kippur War, the discussion over raising the American nuclear alert. If I'll go back and read the minutes of that, it's not just a discussion of what's happening in the Middle East, it's a discussion at home. And a discussion in particular about whether Haig and Kissinger should do that when Nixon's not in the room, which they do. So understanding the domestic politics that are driving them, understanding the role of the national security establishment, the role of the National Security Council, the role or the non-presence of the president in the decision to raise the DEFCON, all of that is only understandable when you get into the material. It totally changes the view you have of how nuclear weapons are handled, how we handle DEFCON, and the role of domestic politics in these decisions during a crisis. Now, it's of course more complex than simply saying domestic politics drives everything, but it fundamentally changes the way we think about these issues. So I think that's absolutely crucial. Now, I'm grading us for the sake of being provocative, but I also actually believe this. I give us a hard F in the way we've done our work, and I'll say why. In my experience, and of course there's a lot I haven't seen, but in my experience, most of the secrets that are held from the American public are partially or largely known by the people we're trying to hold them from overseas and not known by the American public. And there's a reverse ordering to this, right? The Manhattan Project is only one of many, many examples of this. But time and again, I'm struck in the archive by how much our adversaries know, how much they pick up, and how little the public knows. One example of this, one of many examples that I wrote about years ago. In 1969, Nixon and Kissinger decide that in order to put pressure on the Soviets, they're going to undertake a number of maneuvers to try to pressure the Soviets to think that the United States might be considering some kind of nuclear action. This is Kissinger's madman theory, to try to get the Soviets to help get us out of Vietnam. If you look carefully at East German documents, which actually recount what's going on in the Soviet Union, the Soviets know exactly what's going on. The American public knows none of it. And in fact, it's misconstrued in the press. This is one of many cases, right, where secrecy empowers the adversary rather than empowering us. And back to my point from before, I worry often that we are using secrecy to empower one political actor or another in our country rather than national security, and national security is being used as an excuse. And I wish that the DNI had talked more about that last night. Again, I'm not a cynic. I'm not arguing that this is what's driving most of classification, but I am arguing that this is a necessary symptom of an over-classification process that allows that behavior. And until we change that, for me, we're in the F space.
Great.
Maybe I'm a tough grader. I don't know.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move to audience questions. Jim has one retort you wanted to make. Is that so?
Yeah, I just had one thing I wanted to say, and I think it sort of follows up from things Jeremi's been talking about, and Sheena too. This on the smoking gun issue, because it's an important question, but I think what going through major document collections give you is big picture understandings, and I think that's more important than any particular document, any particular sort of smoking gun. Just to give you an example, I once went through for a book I was working on. Clinton's National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, his classified papers, which didn't have access to, but his declassified papers are housed at the Library of Congress. And I went through the collection and all these small little note cards, with this very difficult to read handwriting. Don't feel sorry for me, but it was kind of a challenge to go through. But what it gave me was he was spending almost all of his time on Haiti, Bosnia, Somalia. Those were three big crises of the first Clinton term. And as I read through, and I kept going through Haiti, Bosnia, Somalia, I was like, where the heck are Russia and China? Like, these are the big things he should be dealing with. But of course, it was these crises and the importance of them politically that led him to spend, note card after note card on those three issues. And I think sort of being able to get that kind of big picture understanding and then thinking about what the implications are when you're thinking about what's really important long term for the United States and its foreign policy, comes from being able to go through a collection like that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.